A healthy 38-year-old father of two collapsed on his kitchen floor with a blood sugar level so low that doctors said it was impossible. His wife told everyone he just needed to sleep it off. He never woke up. Michael Brandon Cochran was born on December 23, 1980, in Beckley, West Virginia, to Michael Edward Cochran and Donna Bolt. He grew up in Raleigh County in the heart of Appalachia, a region where everybody seems to know everybody, and reputation matters as much as money. Raised primarily as an only child, his stepfather, Ed Bolt, entered his life when Michael was around 8 years old. The two formed a bond that would last the rest of Michael's life, a connection built on shared experiences and genuine affection. From boyhood, Michael was defined by physical activity. He played baseball, basketball, and football with a passion that would define his youth. He got his first set of weights around age 10 or 11, and by high school had won first place in a powerlifting competition. Fitness and sport were woven into his identity from childhood, a detail that would later become a central argument in his own murder trial. When Michael was around 17, he met a girl named Natalie Jessup, reportedly at a sporting goods store where she worked. Both eventually enrolled at West Virginia University, Michael studying information technology and Natalie pursuing pharmacy. In November of 1999, during their first semester, they got engaged. They married in May of 2000, beginning what appeared to be a storybook romance. After the wedding, Michael and Natalie settled in Daniels, West Virginia, and began building the kind of life that looks from the outside completely ordinary and good. Michael worked in information technology, doing work connected to cable and coaxial systems. Natalie became a licensed pharmacist, a profession that carried real weight in their community, giving her instant credibility wherever she went. The couple had 2 children, a daughter named Nicole and a son named Ashton. If you asked the people who actually knew Michael, the truest part of his identity was not his job, but fatherhood and youth sports. Michael coached football and baseball. He was the kind of man other parents wanted on the sidelines, present and invested, not just for his own children, but for other kids too. One family friend described how after a young boy in their community lost his father, Michael stepped in without hesitation. He took the boy fishing, brought him to practices, and gave that child a steady male presence he no longer had at home. This was the Michael Cochran who existed before any of this began. A husband, a father, a coach, a man who gave freely of his time and energy to those around him. For 17 years, this was simply Michael's life. Nothing suggested tragedy was coming. Nothing pointed toward the devastating events that would unfold in 2019. That began to change in 2017 when Michael and Natalie became connected to a new company called Tactical Solutions Group, often referred to as TSG. On paper, and especially on its own website, TSG presented itself as a serious government contracting business, claiming to be a supplier to the United States Department of Defense. A second company called Technology Management Solutions operated alongside it, creating the appearance of a thriving enterprise. Natalie quit her job as a pharmacist to run the business full-time, becoming majority owner while Michael held a minority stake. To the family and the wider community, it looked like an exciting new chapter. Natalie, the trusted local pharmacist, stepping into government, contracting, and entrepreneurship. What nobody knew yet was that according to investigators, Tactical Solutions Group had never actually been awarded a single federal or state government contract. Technology Management Solutions had secured 2 state contracts, but West Virginia ended up canceling both due to repeated delays. The grand image of a defense supplying company was built on almost nothing, but Natalie did not present it that way. She told friends and family the business model was inspired by the movie War Dogs, a story about young entrepreneurs who made fortunes navigating loopholes in military contracting. To people who had known Natalie and Michael for years and trusted them completely, it sounded like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a chance to be part of something bigger than themselves. So they invested, these friends and family members, who had known the Cochrans for years. Natalie persuaded at least 11 people to put a combined total of approximately $2.5 million into the business. To make the promises look credible, prosecutors later said she used stolen identifying information belonging to people connected to government and banking institutions, sending investors emails that appeared to come from those legitimate sources. This was not just verbal deception. It was an entire false paper trail designed to convince people that their money was safe and their returns were guaranteed. The lifestyle that followed made the lie even more convincing, creating a facade of success that blinded everyone around them. The Cochrans eventually owned 3 homes, bought motorcycles in an antique 1965 Shelby Cobra, and took vacations to Paris and Hawaii. On one loan application for $100,000, Natalie and Michael reportedly claimed business assets exceeding $500,000. The money appeared to be flowing, the business appeared to be thriving, and nobody questioned the source of their sudden wealth. Before the larger fraud became public, there was an earlier warning sign few people connected at the time. Natalie had served as treasurer for a youth baseball league account, and members began to suspect money was missing after a fundraiser. A private investigator named James Quisenberry found purchases at places like TJ Maxx and Olive Garden, made with funds meant for the kids' program. Natalie was never criminally charged over the baseball league money, but the suspicion planted a seed. There is one detail that matters enormously for understanding Michael's role in everything that follows. According to former investigators, Michael Cochran did not know the business was a fraud. He participated in looking for contracts to bid on, but that, according to one investigator's testimony, was about the extent of his involvement. The same false information Natalie was feeding to investors, she was also feeding to her own husband, keeping him as much in the dark as everyone else. By 2018 and into early 2019, cracks were forming in the carefully constructed facade. Investors who had handed over their life savings or retirement funds wanted to know where their returns were, and their questions were becoming more insistent, more difficult to deflect. And so did Michael, who had begun to notice discrepancies that troubled him deeply. Text messages, later examined by investigators, showed Michael beginning to realize there were things about the business he did not understand, particularly the gap between how much money investors said they had put in and what Natalie had actually told him. He was not asking these questions as an outsider. He was asking them as a husband and business partner who believed completely that the company was real and that the money existed somewhere. He simply could not understand why it kept being delayed, why the funds never seemed to materialize, why every promised payout was pushed further into the future. Natalie's solution, according to the prosecution's later theory, was to schedule a trip that would finally provide the answers Michael was seeking. Michael and Natalie were supposedly going to fly to Lynchburg, Virginia, to meet with bank executives and finally access funds connected to the supposed government contracts. A pilot was booked, arrangements were made, and Michael, according to a close friend named Christopher Davis, who later testified about it, was genuinely excited. He believed this was the day he would finally get answers, finally see proof, finally understand that the business his wife had built really was as successful as she always said. The flight was scheduled for the morning of February 6, 2019, a date that would become infamous in the annals of this tragic story. That same morning, Natalie texted the pilot and canceled it without explanation, a decision that would set in motion a chain of events leading to Michael's death. On the same day that flight to Lynchburg was supposed to happen, something else was unfolding inside the Cochran home, something that would take years to fully understand and would ultimately lead to a murder conviction. A neighbor named Jennifer Davis later testified that Natalie had complained she was feeling ill and needed insulin. Davis packed insulin into a bag and had her husband drop it off at the Cochran house that morning on his way to work. Natalie reportedly told Davis she needed it for herself, a statement that would later take on immense significance. At 12:21 in the afternoon, Natalie texted a contractor named Jason Bowen and asked him to come to the house because Michael was sick. When Bowen arrived, he found Michael lying on the kitchen floor, unresponsive and unable to move. Natalie asked him to help move Michael to the couch, a request that seemed odd given the severity of Michael's condition. Bowen would later testify that Michael did not respond when people spoke to him, that even a sternum rub, a hard knuckle pressed into the chest meant to wake an unconscious person through pain, produced no reaction whatsoever. After the insulin had been dropped off, Natalie reportedly sent Jennifer Davis a photograph of Michael unconscious on the kitchen floor. Davis described the image as shocking, a scene that would haunt her for years to come. More people began arriving at the house as word spread that something was terribly wrong. Stephanie Hamilton, a physician assistant and close family friend, came and found Michael completely unresponsive, his body limp and unresponsive. She told Natalie that he needed to be checked by a medical professional and offered to go with her to get him help immediately, her training telling her that time was of the essence. According to Hamilton's later testimony, Natalie's response was that Michael needed to sleep it off, a dismissal that defied all medical logic. Christopher Davis, the same friend who had spoken with Michael about the Lynchburg trip, also came to the house and found Michael on the couch, not talking, not responding to anything around him. Davis insisted that Michael be taken to the hospital, his urgency growing as he watched Michael's condition deteriorate. Hours had passed since Michael first collapsed on the kitchen floor. Multiple people had seen him unconscious, had witnessed his complete lack of response, had urged that he receive emergency medical care immediately. And yet it was not until later that day that Michael finally arrived at the hospital, the delay proving catastrophic. When he did arrive, his blood glucose level was 21, a number so low that medical professionals would later describe it as close to fatal on its own. To put that number in context, a normal blood sugar level typically ranges between 70 and 100 milligrams per deciliter. A level below 54 is considered severely low and requires immediate medical intervention. 21 was not just low, it was dangerously, devastatingly low, a level at which the body begins to shut down and the brain starts to suffer irreversible damage. A physician assistant who saw the case later explained it plainly. Nobody should have a blood sugar level of 21. A person at that level is typically in a coma, fighting for their life, their organs beginning to fail as their body struggles to maintain basic functions. By the time doctors examined Michael, the damage had already begun. He had developed cerebral edema, severe swelling of the brain caused by the prolonged catastrophic drop in his blood sugar. The brain, starved of glucose for too long, had begun to swell, pressing against the skull and causing widespread damage that could not be reversed. He never regained consciousness, never opened his eyes again, never spoke another word. Michael was transferred into hospice care, the medical team having determined that there would be no recovery. The swelling in his brain was too severe, the damage too extensive. The window for intervention had long since closed by the time anyone had gotten him real medical help, those precious hours lost forever. On February 11, 2019, Michael Brandon Cochran died at the age of 38, leaving behind 2 children and a community in shock. At the time of Michael's death, it looked to almost everyone outside the immediate investigation like a sudden and devastating medical tragedy. A relatively healthy man, a husband, a father, a coach, had inexplicably suffered a catastrophic drop in blood sugar and died, leaving his family and community reeling. There was grief, genuine and profound grief, as those who had known and loved Michael tried to make sense of what had happened. There was an obituary that spoke of a man who loved life and loved coaching youth sports, a man who had touched countless lives through his generosity and kindness. In lieu of flowers, the family asked for donations to Shady Spring Middle School baseball, a final tribute to the role youth sports had played in Michael's entire life. Nobody at that point was calling it murder. Nobody was questioning the circumstances surrounding his death. In the months after Michael's death, the financial side of the investigation that had quietly been building around Natalie's business continued to develop. Investors who had never received their promised returns kept pushing for answers, and eventually their complaints reached federal authorities. In June of 2019, police executed a search warrant on the Cochran home connected specifically to the financial fraud investigation. While searching the house, they found insulin, a discovery that did not immediately reopen Michael's cause of death, but was logged and documented. It would not be forgotten, this small piece of evidence that would later prove crucial. In September of 2019, Natalie was formally indicted on federal charges connected to wire fraud, bankruptcy fraud, and money laundering. The investigation revealed the true scale of what she had built, a scheme that ran from approximately June 2017 through at least August of 2019, persuading at least 11 people to invest roughly $2.5 million into contracts that, according to federal prosecutors, were either grossly exaggerated or did not exist at all. A retired West Virginia state trooper named Timothy Bledsoe later testified to something particularly disturbing about the case, something that spoke to the depth of Natalie's deception. Natalie had continued looking for new investors to fund the fake military contracting business even after Michael had died, her scheme not stopping with her husband's death, but continuing to grow and expand. The fraud had become so ingrained in her identity that even the loss of her husband could not stop her from pursuing more money, more deception, more lies. In 2020, Natalie pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering, a decision that seemed to close the book on the financial crimes. As part of the plea agreement, she agreed to pay nearly $2.6 million in restitution and to forfeit assets that included 2 pieces of real estate, the 1965 Shelby Cobra, multiple other vehicles, jewelry, and roughly $45,000 from a business account. In March of 2021, she was sentenced to 135 months in federal prison, more than 11 years, in order to pay over $2.5 million in restitution. For the public, this looked like the end of the story. A pharmacist turned fraudster caught, convicted, sentenced. But investigators had not stopped looking at the insulin found in that house 2 years earlier, and they had not stopped questioning the circumstances of Michael's death. In November of 2021, while Natalie was already serving her federal sentence for fraud, she was indicted on a new and far more serious charge, first-degree murder for the death of her husband, Michael Cochran. The murder case moved slowly through the legal system, delayed by exhumation procedures, additional forensic testing, and pretrial motions. Michael's body had to be exhumed 7 months after his original burial so that a new autopsy could be performed, a process that would ultimately provide crucial evidence for the prosecution. Medical examiner Dr. Piotr Kubicek conducted that exhumation autopsy and testified that he could not determine a clear cause of death, decomposition over those 7 months having made it impossible to identify potential injection sites or confirm insulin use directly from the tissue. That inconclusive result became one of the strongest tools in the defense's arsenal once the case finally reached trial in January of 2025 in Raleigh County Circuit Court. Prosecutors Tom Truman and Ashley Accord built their case around a central argument. Natalie killed Michael because he was getting too close to discovering the Ponzi scheme, and the canceled Lynchburg flight was the breaking point. If Michael had gone to that bank and found no money waiting for him, the entire fraud and Natalie's freedom would have collapsed. The medical testimony at trial became the battlefield, with experts on both sides presenting conflicting interpretations of the evidence. Endocrinologist Dr. Diane Krieger testified that the brain swelling had already begun by the time Michael reached the hospital, and that insulin was, in her professional opinion, the only explanation that made medical sense. Forensic pathologist Dr. Paul Uribe went even further, testifying that Michael's blood glucose level of 21 was, in his words, profound, and concluding that Michael had been administered insulin and that his death was a homicide. Uribe acknowledged there was no direct physical evidence of insulin found in Michael's body since the exhumation autopsy happened years after death, but he maintained that there was simply no other reasonable medical explanation for such a severe and persistent hypoglycemic state in an otherwise healthy, non-diabetic man. FBI forensic examiner Earl Gleam testified about an insulin vial recovered from the Cochran home, stating that the rubber top appeared to have been punctured, suggesting recent use. Another FBI chemist confirmed that 2 of 3 liquid bottles recovered from the house matched their labels, insulin and a steroid, while a third did not match what it claimed to contain. Investigators also revealed that Natalie had given conflicting accounts of what happened that day, her story shifting as the pressure mounted. In one version, she said she and Michael were sitting together when he walked into the kitchen, fell, and hit his head on the counter. In another version given the very next day, she said Michael had been asleep on the couch, later walked into the kitchen, and collapsed there. She also claimed Michael had been injecting himself with insulin in his back, a claim that the prosecution argued was an attempt to deflect suspicion. The defense, led by attorneys Matthew Victor and Stanley Selden, did not deny the financial crimes. Their argument was that Natalie was perhaps dishonest in her financial dealings, but that dishonesty did not make her a murderer. They leaned heavily into Michael's relationship with fitness and supplements, with Natalie's own daughter Nicole testifying that her father was obsessed with his physique and took enormous quantities of supplements daily. Both children testified about alleged steroid use, including claims of oral steroids obtained from Mexico and anabolic steroid injections. The defense argument was straightforward. Maybe Michael's death came from supplement use or an underlying health issue that had nothing to do with Natalie at all. The jury did not find that argument convincing. On January 29, 2025, the jury found Natalie Cochran guilty of first-degree murder. They had deliberated for less than 2 hours, a remarkably short window that both prosecutors and Michael's family interpreted as a sign of just how compelling the state's case had been. The jury then denied mercy, sentencing Natalie to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her attorneys later filed motions seeking acquittal or a new trial, arguing the case should have been moved to a different venue and that certain evidence should never have been admitted. Judge H.L. Kirkpatrick denied those motions, finding that the jury had acted fairly throughout. Michael Cochran spent 19 years trusting the person closest to him, right up until the day that trust cost him everything.